Ask any Devil May Cry fan which game from the original series is their least favorite, and after they stop fuming about how much they didn't like the DMC reboot, most likely they will say Devil May Cry 2. But why is this? Well, a lot of it has to do with who developed it. After the initial success of the first Devil May Cry in Japan, for whatever reason, Capcom chose to use a different team from the original to develop the sequel. Hideki Kamiya and Team Little Devil, the team that made the first game, supposedly didn't even find out about the development of the sequel until after localization of the first game in North America and Europe had started. Unfortunately, this meant that the new development team, who didn't have any hands-on with the first game, also didn't really understand what made Devil May Cry what it was, which ultimately would be damaging to the success of the sequel. Welcome to part 2 of my Devil May Cry series retrospective.
Let's rock, baby!
So one of the first notable changes to Devil May Cry's formula was the main character, Dante himself. Compared to the previous installment, where he was more cocky and goofy, this slightly older Dante was made more serious and brooding. I guess Capcom jumped on that bandwagon early. This was a bit of a mistake because if you want to shift a character's attitude or outlook, that's fine, you just need to find a reason for them to change and a story to explore that, which the story of DMC doesn't do. There isn't a reason given for Dante to be so quiet and brooding compared to his earlier, more cheerful self. Hell, the story explores our new character Lucia more than it does our main character. The reason Dante was likable in the first game was because he didn't take himself so seriously, even when going against monstrous demons, which makes it easy to root for him and gave some gravitas for his more serious moments. DMC2 Dante is instead almost mute and doesn't really have any character. Admittedly, it would be difficult to further Dante's character after the first game, since he defeated the one who took his mother and brother, which fulfills his character motivation. But older Dante doesn't even have his own motive for being in this new story, which brings me to the clumsy way they fit him in.
Looks like it's your lucky day.
An odd trait Dante was given in the sequel was flipping a coin when making a decision. He does this when Lucia's mother, Mathieu, asks him for assistance in stopping the main villain Arias, as if to explain why he would help Lucia or her mother, because being a devil-hunting bounty hunter isn't enough of a reason. He previously stated he wants to hunt all demons since they were what killed his mother, so why he needs the coin toss is confusing. It's made even more confusing when it's revealed that the coin is two-headed. So the coin flip wasn't even about leaving it up to luck, meaning he always knew the outcome and was always going to help. This might seem altruistic, but it comes off more as the writers trying to make Dante more cool and aloof. Compare this to Harvey Dent in The Dark Knight. He does the same two-headed coin trick, but he does this in order to get what he wants, all the while tricking people into thinking he's just lucky, but in fact he makes his own luck. Meanwhile, Dante doesn't really benefit from these coin flips, since the outcome is him helping someone, which he was already planning on doing, so there's no real point in it other than to give this idea that he's flippant and devil may care. While it has its own problems that I'll be getting to in another video, even the Devil May Cry anime handles Dante's gambling much better because it portrays him as actually having bad luck. Multiple characters take advantage of this, betting that they'll pay Dante's outstanding tab if he wins, but he has to do the job they give him if he loses, wherein he proceeds to lose the bet. To me, this characterizes Dante as being a bit hapless, much better at demon killing than gambling, not someone that's trying to look detached from the situation he's in. It might seem like I'm overly focusing on this one quirk, but that's because there isn't much else to talk about in regards to Dante. This is really highlighted in the fact that there's actually no internal reasoning for Dante to be involved in the game's plot. In DMC 1, Dante had personal reasons to be on Mallet Island. He wanted to avenge his mother and brother. I will be getting into it in another video, but in DMC 3, Dante has a purpose to be involved in the plot. With Dante in DMC 2, you could swap him out for a different character entirely and lose practically nothing because this Dante has no personal investment in what's going on except to beat the bad guy.
Now we can stop Arius' ambition.
Whatever.
That doesn't necessarily make him a bad character, but it does make him a much less engaging character. because he has no stakes in the story, so the player has no real investment in his success.
Yeah. Let's go all the way to hell.
Though overall, Dante is just the main character of the game. The real protagonist of the story, the one who has a character arc throughout, is the new playable character Lucia. The game's plot, or at least the half that's in her campaign, centers around Lucia trying to stop an evil businessman named Arius from raising the demon Argosax using the legendary MacGuffins. Arcana. Thus, she seeks Dante's help. When Lucia finally confronts Arius, we get a startling revelation.
Well, it appears that the defect is back.
Defect?
You are my creation.
Yes, Arius created Lucia and abandoned her, only for her to be found by Mathieu. This causes her to question who and what she actually is, worrying that she might one day turn on humans, which was a really interesting character arc that we never really see in future DMC games. If the writers would have fleshed this out a bit more, we could have gotten a really compelling character. Except by the end, we get the same exact ending as Trish in DMC 1.
I'll go. I'm expendable. You don't need to worry about me. I'm happy if I can die like a human.
No. Devils never cry.
Dante,
Trish, devils never cry. These tears are a gift only humans have.
And this leads into one of the biggest issues with the story of this game, and that is that it is so rushed. So, Devil May Cry 1 wasn't a masterpiece when it came to its story. Trish has very rushed character development, and the dialogue at the end is pretty poorly written, but the game benefited from having a simple plot. A half-demon man is lured to an island by a woman in order to fight a demon king. Woman is actually in cahoots with the demon king, who had killed the man's mom years ago. Man beats demon king. Oh, and man's brainwashed brother is there too. See, simple and easy to understand, right? The trouble that the sequel has is that it tries to be grander in scale than the first, bringing the threat to a modern setting rather than a secluded island, but nothing is ever explained or justified. Everything happens because of reasons. Why did Lucia call Dante to this museum just to immediately leave? When and why did Lucia dress up like Arius' bodyguard? How did Arius create his dolls? The ritual failed because Arius didn't have all the pieces, so why did the demon world still open up? Who even is Argosax? Who cares, says the game. Nobody plays these games for good storytelling anyways, right? And this could be a valid thought process, except the gameplay is full of its own holes. Early on, the gameplay doesn't feel quite right, especially when compared to the game's predecessor. It has a focus on combos with a style ranking system much like the first game, but there's no diversity in the combo strings you can do. In the prior game, you had a multitude of skills between Alistair, Ifrit, and Sparta. The combos could even be varied by adding slight pauses between button presses. DMC 2, on the other hand, is lacking on any skills beyond airtime and stinger, meaning most combos are just mashing the attack button with no real thought needed, resulting in a lot of this. In addition to the lack of skills learned early on, is the absence of purchasing and learning new techniques. One of the best parts of Devil May Cry was adding new skills to your repertoire, allowing you to do more stylish combos with impactful new moves. Hitting a demon with a fully charged magma drive with Ifrit in the first game had such great impact and feel to it that it was worth the purchase. DMC 2 throws this out the window and has an upgrade system where you increase the weapon's damage instead. This doesn't make the game more enjoyable though, it just makes it easier to kill enemies with the same repetitive combo you've been using the whole time, which, retroactively, just makes the game more boring. Even the weapons are dull, and playing as a demon hunter, I feel that's a problem. In games of this nature, finding the weapons is its own reward. Having levels based around it and even cinematics to show off your new arsenal really added to the excitement of gaining new weapons in DMC 1. This was also thrown out the window. Instead, you find the weapons just lying around. If you blink, you might miss them. Though, even if you do miss them, you're not missing much. They're all pretty generic swords with names like Merciless and Vendetta, as if the developers flipped through a 90s comic book to get ideas for names. Dante's future trademark sword Rebellion is even described as an ordinary sword. I find this confusing because if they weren't going to bring back the double arms from the previous game, which is understandable since Dante seems to always garbage his weapons after each adventure, why not attempt to create ones as unique and diverse? Alistair, Ifrit, and Sparta all had different qualities and moves that incentivized switching between them and maximized your combo potential. The only difference between the swords in Devil May Cry 2 were varying lengths and the general strength of the weapons. Mid-gameplay, it's hard to tell which sword you're even using at the time. The only reason to use one sword over the other is simply preference. The same goes for Lucia's blades as well. But the focus wasn't really on making the melee combat better, it was on the guns. For some reason, the designers of DMC2 thought that the weapons that were only really used for lengthening combos and dealing with airborne enemies in the first game should be the centerpiece of the second game. And this seemed to be a design choice since the trailers for DMC2 focused most on Dante's gunplay and acrobatics. A lot of the gameplay problems arose from this decision though. Most enemies and even bosses don't require much thought other than shooting them repeatedly with Dante's trademark pistols, Ebony and Ivory. Even the other guns are made slightly ineffectual since, by the time you find them, you've probably upgraded Ebony and Ivory once or twice, resulting in them being more useful than anything else. I believe this refocusing on firearms is why the upgrade system is based around increasing damage, since it's hard to make innovative or stylish techniques for shooting a gun. Previously, the firearms were just used for long-distance combat or breaking open enemy guards, but they never had any added skills that you could purchase because the melee combat was the focus. The shift to more gun-focused gameplay wasn't the biggest change though. During the early stages of development, the team making the game sent out surveys to see what about the first game they could fix. And while the change in weapons and gameplay style were poor decisions, the most detrimental change to Devil May Cry 2 from the previous game was the difficulty. Now, it's an understandable goal to want to make your game easier when you get feedback that the previous entry was a bit too hard, but the developers went too far in the other direction. Many enemies and even bosses don't really put up any sort of fight, and will usually just stand around. This was a big change from the first game because the challenge that Devil May Cry 1 had was one of its most defining traits, and made it more rewarding for completing it. Supposedly, DMC2 was supposed to have a scaling difficulty, changing depending on how well you play, to make the game more forgiving than its predecessor. Though I don't think that was ever implemented, or if it was, it's unnoticeable. It's almost laughable that you get a yellow orb for reviving during the first mission because it's unlikely you will use it by the end of the game due to how little damage most enemies will do and how many health pickups are usually left lying around. And even if your health does go down to dangerous levels, you can go into Majin form / desperate double trigger mode, an upgraded double trigger that makes Dante almost invincible. Even the puzzles through the game were simplified or removed to make the game easier to progress through, which brings me to DMC2's level design. Another emphasis for the developers when making DMC2 was to make the environments much larger than the previous game. While this was done in hopes of making a better game, it was a fundamental misunderstanding. DMC1 benefited from the tight Resident Evil-like corridors because, with the tone and general aesthetic, it added a sense of dread and suspense. And when you ended up in a wider room, you almost knew that some new enemy was going to pop out with some cool cutscene to introduce them. The larger areas in DMC2 make most levels feel empty, and not in an eerie, suspenseful sort of way, more like a there's nothing to do way. You spend too much time running through empty parts of the level, which results in a lot of this. And if you want to play through Lucia's campaign, you will have to go through these same levels twice, since most of her levels are the same as Dante's, but done in reverse or in a different order. And while I gave the first game shit for having an underwater mission, it at least didn't have an underwater puzzle or boss fight. Now, making wider, more expansive levels could have worked, and possibly been a good design decision, except the larger city environments also just look really bland and lifeless. The use of empty, dilapidated towns and cities means the general color palette is a lot of browns and grays, meaning nothing really stands out or is visually striking. There isn't really any mix-up until the last few levels when the demon world opens up and there's more dark purples and reds to go with the sudden twisted world. It's because of this that I don't really find any of the settings really memorable. The general enemy design is also missing something. Most of the enemies have a Western European influence, being based on cherubs, golems, and cloaked wizards, which is an interesting shift after DMC1, except other than the Abyss Goats, none of the enemies really have a demonic or even intimidating look. Much like the environments, the enemies are bland and uninteresting, which makes them feel more like cannon fodder rather than an actual threat. This isn't helped by the fact that most of the minor demons after the first mission just start appearing at some point without any sort of introduction. In DMC1, the minor demons were introduced with a stylish or menacing cutscene. This was effective because it showed the players their new threat before they actually encountered them in order to highlight the demon's distinct qualities. DMC2 just eventually goes, nah, put them out there, who cares? Which makes the new enemies much less intimidating by comparison since they're just basically lying around waiting to be found. The secret missions are also really lacking in anything. Devil May Cry 1 used the secret missions to give an extra challenge to the players who could find them with a part of a blue orb as a reward, either adding in requirements to defeating an enemy or having them do a special task. Some of the objectives were ridiculously hard, like Secret Mission 8, but it did add a bit of variety to the game. In contrast, DMC2 simply has you go into a square room and defeat a couple waves of enemies. This confuses the purpose of the secret missions, which is to test the player's ability beyond what they normally do within the game. Not throw the same enemies they've been facing since the start of the game, but in a small square room. Now, what about the bosses of DMC2? Unfortunately, most of them feel very uninspired. There's Mothra, an evil helicopter, Phantom again, Hentai, Big Fish, Tiny King Kong, and Boss Rush Blob. Some of these could have been interesting if any of them were given some type of characterization, but they all just appear with no real build-up, fight you, and then disappear, never to be mentioned again. Especially by fans. The reason that Phantom and Griffin were memorable was because, aside from having fun boss fights and cool designs, they had moments to establish why they wanted to destroy Dante, giving this weight to the recurring battles with them. In contrast, DMC2's reuse of Phantom is just kind of sent out with no real setup, like, ta-da! Look, it's Phantom, your favorite, right? The most egregious, though, is Bulwark, who might as well be called Nello Angelo too. I say this because the creators tried to recreate that same rival dynamic that Dante and Nello Angelo had in the first game, with the same multiple encounter setup and the sense that he's hunting Dante, but it falls so flat because, just like with Dante, there's zero characterization for Bulwark beyond being a spooky boss skeleton that looks like he came out of a Soul Calibur game. It says in the Devil May Cry graphic arts book that the damage to his skull was from a fight with Sparta, Dante's father, which could explain why he was out for Dante. Too bad we don't get that story in the game though. Bulwark does have wolves though, so he's got that going for him. The boss fights are also frustrating because most of them try to keep you at a distance, so shooting them is the only real effective strategy, which results in a lot of standing at a distance firing and occasionally jumping to avoid an attack. More than one boss also doesn't have any actual attacks, and resorts to just throwing lower enemies at you to make the fight more difficult, with Noctiferin, or however you pronounce that, being the worst offender of this. Two bosses I will give credit to though are Trismegia and Nephastris. Seriously, who names these guys? Trismegia is an interesting take on the elemental changing boss, and becomes a shell game when it separates into 3 heads, requiring the player to find the one that will take damage. Nephastris, on the other hand, I mention mostly because its design is an interesting concept, fitting the setting, as well as it has a pretty awesome intro. Something Capcom knew since it's the only boss intro highlighted in the trailers. Now, not everything in Devil May Cry 2 is necessarily bad. Dante's redesign is a step up from DMC 1 and suits what you think a demon hunter might look like, having a bit of a Spawn meets Punisher vibe. And while she comes from an odd trope in Japan of tan girls with red hair, Lucia also has a pretty good design that's unique to her. This is probably because Capcom decided to partner with the clothing company Diesel to help with character designs, and there are even Diesel-inspired outfits for Dante and Lucia after completing the game once. DMC2 also added a dedicated dodge roll button, which makes avoiding enemy attacks much more simpler, rather than having to hold the lock-on button and then press jump in the direction at the same time. And in the way of fixing issues that DMC1 had, the camera behaves much better, which makes platforming easier, but it's still not perfect. Another addition I have personally enjoyed was the customizable devil trigger. Over the course of the game, you pick up pieces of an amulet that affect how your devil trigger operates. This allowed some customability that was lacking in the weapons section. It also added an elemental factor to combat, which could have been used more, but instead was implemented pretty sparingly. Though if you found the Chrono Heart, you could do this. Now, this video wasn't meant to just shit on Devil May Cry 2 and anyone who actually might like it, but more explain why fans of the first Devil May Cry felt it was a serious step down in quality. On a fundamental level, DMC2 isn't a bad game, just a bad sequel, which in some cases can be seen as worse. There were just a lot of poor design decisions. It lost any challenge the first game had, and while the previous entry could be teeth-grittingly difficult at times, it's that element that pushed players to try and beat the game, which in turn makes it a more engaging experience. The team who developed DMC2 wanted to make an easier, more accessible game, which is commendable, but lost sight of what made Devil May Cry 1 stand out so much from the other games on the market. Essentially, Devil May Cry 2 is just boring, with underutilized characters, uninteresting villains, bland environments, low difficulty, and shallow gameplay. The game's final director, Hideaki Itsuno, who directed CVS 2 and Power Stone 2, was apparently brought on halfway through DMC2's development due to Capcom being unhappy with the work being done by the previous director. Capcom essentially brought Itsuno onto the project to salvage the game rather than scrap the whole thing, which is ironic since they were the ones who passed up on letting the first game's development team handle the sequel. Though, while Devil May Cry 2 was a fumble for Capcom, it would set the way for arguably the best game in the series. But we'll get to that next time.